If you are new here, we are reading out of the NIV Daily Bible. So it's the NIV translation, and it is the entire Bible split up into 365 daily readings. Every day we pick up where we left off the day before. So there are a lot of daily devotionals that kind of bounce around the Bible. That's not what this is. We are reading consecutively through the Old Testament and the New Testament at the same time. We also have a portion from Psalms or Proverbs every day. So yesterday we left off in Exodus. Today we're going to pick back up in Exodus. Yesterday we left off in Mark. Today we're going to pick back up in Mark. And the only thing that is a little bit inconsistent is going to be Psalms or Proverbs, because we kind of bounce in between. We'll read a Psalm and then we'll read a portion from Proverbs. So today we have Proverbs chapter 5. So I want to encourage you guys to endure the Old Testament portion. It's going to be a little bit long, but the Old Testament lays the foundation for the New Testament. And if you do not understand the rules of the Old Testament, you will not understand what Jesus is doing and why it's so significant, because he's constantly quoting the Old Testament. He's constantly referring back to the rules to kind of throw it in the Pharisees and the Sadducees' face, right? So you need to understand the rules of the Old Testament so that when you see things like Jesus sitting with a woman at the well, you understand the significance of it, okay? So this part of Exodus is not exactly the most riveting, but it's really important to understand the rules of the Old Testament and the guidelines to understand the culture and to understand Jesus, okay? So, with that being said, let's get into it. We have Exodus chapter 21, verses 1 through 22, verses 31. So it's a little bit longer today than normal. So, these are the laws you are to set before them. Hebrew servants. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years. But in the 7th year, he shall go free without paying anything. If he comes alone, he is to go free alone. But if he has a wife when he comes, she is to go with him. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons and daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and only the man shall go free. But if the servant declares, I love my master and my wife and children, and do not want to go free, then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door or the doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. Then he will be his servant for life. If a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to go free as men servants do. If she does not please the master who has elected her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to foreigners because he has broken faith with her. This sounds very anti-female, but they're basically saying he has to honor her. He can't just pawn her off. He can't just use her and pawn her off. He has to honor her. If he selects her for his son, he must grant her the rights of a daughter. If he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, and marital rights. If he does not provide her with these 3 things, she is to go free without any payment of money. Personal injuries. Anyone who strikes a man and kills him shall surely be put to death. However, if he does not do it intentionally, because intent matters, but God lets it happen, he is to flee to a place I will designate. Remember, the Bible had sanctuary cities. But if a man schemes and kills another man deliberately, so the sanctuary cities were for unintentional harm, but deliberately, take him away from my altar and put him to death. Anyone who attacks his father or his mother must be put to death. Anyone who kidnaps another and either sells him or still has him when he is caught must be put to death. I'm going to start using a different word because I don't want the TikTok live to get banned. Anyone who curses his father or mother will be put down. If men quarrel and one hits the other with a stone or with his fist, and he does not die but is confined to bed, the one who struck the blow will not be held responsible. If the other gets up and walks around outside with his staff, however, he must pay the injured man for the loss of his time and see that he is completely healed. If a man beats his male or female slave with a rod and the slave dies as a direct result, he must be punished. But he is not to be punished if the slave gets up after a day or two, since the slave is his property. If men who are fighting hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there is no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there is a serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. This is interesting. I've always heard the eye for eye, but I never heard it in this context of the unborn child or the prematurely born child. So up here you see if a man gets in a fight and hurts another man, it's kind of just like whatever, you know what I mean? Like he has to pay a fine, right? But if it's the unborn child or the prematurely born child, then it's an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, or a foot for a foot, a burn for a burn, wound for wound, and bruise for bruise. This is a very interesting case for pro-lifers, and I'm really surprised that I've never heard the pro-life movement talk about this, because this is so specific. And it kind of shows God's heart towards pregnant women and unborn children. So moving forward, if a man hits a manservant or maidservant in the eye and destroys it, he must let the servant go free to compensate for the eye. And if he knocks out the tooth of a manservant or maidservant, he must let the servant go free to compensate for the tooth. So he's basically saying, if you injure your servant, they get to go free. If a bull gores a man or a woman to death, the bull must be stoned to death, and its meat must not be eaten. Interesting, mad cow disease. But the owner of the bull will not be held responsible. If, however, the bull has had the habit of goring, and the owner has been warned, but has not kept it penned up, and it kills a man or a woman, the bull must be stoned, and the owner also must be put to death. However, if payment is demanded of him, he may redeem his life by paying whatever is demanded. This law also applies if the bull gores a son or a daughter. If the bull gores a male or female slave, the owner must pay 30 shekels of silver to the master of the slave, and the bull must be stoned. If a man uncovers a pit or digs one and fails to cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit must pay for the loss. He must pay its owner, and the dead animal will be his. If a man's bull injures the bull of another and it dies, they are to sell the live one and divide both the money and the dead animal equally. However, if it was known that the bull had the habit of goring, yet the owner did not keep it penned up, the owner must pay, animal for animal, and the dead animal will be his. Protection of property. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he must pay back 5 head of cattle for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. If a thief is caught breaking in and is struck so that he dies, the defender is not guilty of bloodshed, but if it happens after sunrise, he is guilty of bloodshed. A thief must certainly make restitution, but if he has nothing, he must be sold to pay for his theft. If the stolen animal is found alive in his possession, whether ox or donkey or sheep, he must pay back double. If a man, this is interesting, so if you get caught stealing, you got to pay back double. If a man grazes his livestock in a field or vineyard and lets them stray and they graze in another man's field, he must make restitution from the best of his own field or vineyard. And I highlighted that because it's like he's got to do it from the best. He can't just give them crappy what's left over. If a fire breaks out and spreads into thorn bushes so that it burns shocks of grain or standing grain or the whole field, the one who started the fire must make restitution. All of these rules just kind of show God is pretty fair. He is pretty fair. If a man gives his neighbor silver or goods for safekeeping and they are stolen from the neighbor's house, the thief, if he is caught, must pay back double. But if the thief is not found, the owner of the house must appear before the judges to determine whether he has laid his hands on the other man's property. In all cases of illegal possession of an ox, a donkey, a sheep, a garment, or any other lost property about which somebody says, "This is mine," both parties are to bring their cases before the judges. The one whom the judges declare guilty must pay back double to his neighbor. I'm really loving this pay back double. And I believe that you are going to get paid back double everything that the enemy has stolen from you. You are going to get paid back double everything that the enemy has stolen from you. If a man gives a donkey, an ox, a sheep, or any other animal to his neighbor for safekeeping, and it dies, or is injured, or is taken away while no one is looking, the issue between them will be settled by the taking of an oath before the Lord that the neighbor did not lay hands on the other person's property. The owner is to accept this, and no restitution is required. But if the animal was stolen from the neighbor, he must make restitution to the owner. If it was torn to pieces by a wild animal, he shall bring in the remains as evidence, and he will not be required to pay for the torn animal. If a man borrows an animal from his neighbor, and it is injured or dies while the owner is not present, he must make restitution. But if the owner is with the animal, the borrower will not have to pay. If the animal was hired, the money paid for the hire covers the loss. Social responsibilities. If a man seduces a virgin who is not pledged to be married and sleeps with her, he must pay the bride price. He must pay the bride price, and she shall be his wife. If her father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he must still pay the bride price for virgins. I love this. Wouldn't it be so nice if the person who took your virginity had to pay the bride price? I think we should bring that back. I think we should bring back dowries and bride prices. I vote for that. I vote for dowries and bride prices. I feel like most of the women would agree. We need our restitution. Anyway, do not allow a sorceress to live. Anyone who has sexual relations with an animal must be put to death. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord must be destroyed. Do not mistreat an alien or oppress him, for you were aliens in Egypt. I'm going to repeat that. Do not mistreat an alien or oppress him, for you were aliens in Egypt. Do not take advantage of a widow or an orphan. If you do, they will cry out to me. I will certainly hear their cry. My anger will be aroused, and I will kill you with the sword. Your wives will become widows, and your children fatherless. I love this. The Lord will hear your cry. The Lord hears your cries. If you lend money to one of my people among you who is needy, do not be like a money lender. Charge him no interest. This is one, I want to highlight this. One of my people. Charge him no interest. These are the key things here. One of my people. Something I've really been talking to my sister a lot about is you can't treat everybody like a child of God, right? You can't treat everybody the same way you would treat a fellow believer and follower of Christ. You treat everybody with respect and love and dignity and kindness, and you are to be a reflection of Christ to all people. But if you know someone is wicked, don't expect them to act like a fellow believer. Like we kind of have to, when we're dealing with people, I'm not saying to be cynical and assume the worst, but you can't necessarily be naive and treat everybody the same, because not everybody has the same morals and we're not all following the same guidelines. We are not all following the same guidelines. And so if you have someone that you know doesn't believe in the Lord, they're not following the same guidelines as you. They don't believe in the same truth as you. So you're expecting them to treat you the way that you would treat them. And the thing is, they're not going to treat you the way that you would treat them, because they are not you. Okay? So something I think is really interesting in the Bible, they'll often say things like, treat them like a pagan, right? So when you have this command of do not charge your fellow brother and sister in Christ interest. It's not saying don't charge everybody else interest, but it's saying do not charge your fellow brother and sister in Christ interest. Okay? There's like specifics. If you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, return it to him by sunset, because his cloak is the only covering he has for his body. What else will he sleep in? When he cries out to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. And I love this. God's basically saying, if you do people dirty and they cry out to me, I'm going to hear it and I'm going to be mad. So you better treat people fairly and kindly and do not exploit them and don't be greedy, you know? He's like warning you, listen, if you cause one of my children to cry out to me, I'm going to get mad and you're going to regret it. So do not blaspheme God or curse the ruler of your people. Do not hold back offerings from your granaries or your vats. You must give me the firstborn of your sons. Do the same with your cattle and your sheep. Let them stay with their mothers for 7 days, but give them to me on the 8th day. You are to be my holy people, so do not eat the meat of an animal torn by wild beasts. Throw it to the dogs. So that is all for our Old Testament portion of the day. Moving forward to our New Testament portion of the day, we are getting into Mark chapter 2, verses 18 through chapter 3, verses 30. So, Jesus questioned about fasting. So this is why it's important to understand the Old Testament and the rules. So right now we're getting into the New Testament. Right away, they're getting into the rules, okay? So if you don't understand the rules that were laid out in the Old Testament, how are you going to understand what the heck Jesus is talking about, the significance of it? You know what I mean? Like, this is why the Old Testament, when it's like rules and stuff like that, it might seem kind of boring, but don't skip that, because you're not going to understand to the full extent of what is going on if you don't understand the rules and the culture, okay? So Jesus questioned about fasting. Now, John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, how is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not? Jesus answered, how can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? They cannot, so long as they have him with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth to an old garment. If he does, the new piece will pull away from the old, making the tear worse. And no one pours new wine into an old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No, he pours new wine into new wineskins. Lord of the Sabbath. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? He answered, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. So this is an Old Testament book where David was fleeing, and on his way out the door, he stopped at this place, at this church essentially, and he grabbed the consecrated bread, which he was not supposed to eat. He gave it to him and his companions, and then he took the sword that they had, the sword that he used to kill Goliath was randomly at this church, and then he grabbed the sword. So that's the story that Jesus is referencing. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. I love this. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. I really want to encourage you guys. In American culture, it is very hard to take a day off. But God is so good that he wants us to rest once every 7 days, once every 7 years, okay? I really want to encourage you guys to try to take a day off and just rest in the Lord. It's a treat. It's a break. And God will replenish you. He will renew you. He will refuel you. He will give you discernment and guidance and strategy, because the Sabbath was made for man. It's a gift. It is truly a gift. You were not meant to be a slave. God does not want you to be a slave to work, a slave to culture, a slave to the grind, a slave to the hustle. That's not what God wants for you. And taking the Sabbath, even when you feel like your needs aren't going to be met, it takes faith. But God is the ultimate provider, and He is a good provider. And when you lean on Him in faith, He always provides. So don't think for 1 second that because you took a Sabbath and honored the Lord that somehow you're not going to meet your provision, because that's when God really shows up in the most miraculous ways. Anyway, moving forward. Another time he went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. They were always looking. The devil is always lurking and waiting for you to mess up so that he can accuse you. They were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. So they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." I love this. He said, watch this. He didn't do it in private. He did it in front of everybody. Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians on how they might kill Jesus. I love this. So I want you guys to really envision this in your head, because everybody has this idea of Jesus that he was some passive, weak, unconfrontational man. Jesus was the most confrontational. Jesus did not fear a good conflict. He was confrontational. He said, "Oh, you guys are looking for a way to accuse me? Stand up, come in front of everybody." And he called them all out. And then he said, "Oh, you're too stubborn to admit that you were wrong? Hold out your hand." Like, Jesus was confrontational. He was not this weak, passive man that people like to portray. He was confrontational when it came to the truth, when it came to helping people, loving people, healing people, redeeming people. Jesus was not afraid. He was not fearful. He was bold. Crowds followed Jesus. Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the lake, and a large crowd from Galilee followed. When they heard all he was doing, how many people came to him from Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, and the regions across the Jordan and around Tyre and Sidon, because of the crowd, he told his disciples to have a small boat ready for him to keep the people from crowding him. For he had healed many, so that those with diseases were pushing forward to touch him. Whenever the evil spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, "You are the Son of God." But he gave them strict orders not to tell who he was. Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. He appointed 12, designating them apostles, that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. These are the 12 he appointed. So he wanted them to preach and drive out demons. He wanted them to preach and drive out demons. This is like one of the foundations of the Christian church, y'all. Preaching and driving out demons. These are the 12 appointed: Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. To them he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Jesus and Beelzebub. Then Jesus entered a house, And again, a crowd gathered so that he and his disciples were not even able to eat. When his family heard about this, they went to take charge of him, for they said, he is out of his mind. So I love this. When his family heard, they even went and they said, oh, he is out of his mind. We better go get our boy. They said, he is acting up. We better go get him. And they were like, we're going to go take charge of him because he is acting a fool. His own family. And the teachers of the law who came down from Jerusalem said, he is possessed by Beelzebub, by the prince of demons. He is driving out demons. So Jesus called them and spoke to them in parables. How can Satan drive out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. If a house is divided against itself, that house cannot stand. And if Satan opposes himself and is divided, he cannot stand. His end has come. In fact, no one can enter a strong man's house and carry off his possessions unless he first ties up the strong man. Then he can rob his house. I tell you the truth, all the sins and blasphemies of men will be forgiven them. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit will never be forgiven. He is guilty of an eternal sin. This is the only sin in the Bible. This is the only thing in the Bible that they say this about. The only thing. He said this because they were saying he has an evil spirit. So moving forward to our reading from Proverbs for the day, we have Proverbs chapter 5, verses 1 through 14. A warning against adultery. My son, pay attention to my wisdom. Listen well to my words of insight, that you may maintain discretion and your lips may preserve knowledge. For the lips of an adulteress drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil, but in the end, she is bitter as gall. But in the end, she is bitter as gall. Sharp as a double-edged sword, her feet go down to death. Her steps lead straight to the grave. She gives no thought to the way of life. Her paths are crooked, but she knows it not. This is interesting. Her paths are crooked, but she knows it not. Now then, my sons, listen to me and do not turn aside from what I say. Keep to a path far from her. Do not go near the door of her house, lest you give your best strength to others and your years to one who is cruel. Lest strangers feast on your wealth and your toil enrich another man's house. At the end of your life, you will groan when your flesh and body are spent. You will say, how I hated discipline, how my heart spurned correction. I would not obey my teachers or listen to my instructors. I have come to the brink of utter ruin in the midst of my whole assembly. So, that is all for today's daily Bible study. If you guys have the goal of reading through the Bible in 1 year, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We go live Monday through Friday, and we upload all of these live Bible studies over there so that if you tune in, you will have read the entire Bible in 1 year.